Silence doesn't hurt a narcissistic personality. Healing does. And that truth changes everything. What actually hurts isn't your disappearance, it's your detachment. And once you understand why, you stop disappearing and start reclaiming power. If this is resonating, take a moment to pause, breathe, and remind yourself clarity is not cruelty. And if you're learning how to detach without guilt, stay with this conversation. This is about your recovery. Silence is often framed as the ultimate act of power, but in narcissistic dynamics, it is frequently misunderstood. Many people believe that withdrawing communication will automatically cause distress, reflection, or remorse. In reality, silence can unintentionally maintain the very imbalance that caused harm in the first place. Narcissistic patterns are not primarily driven by emotional connection. They are driven by control, regulation of self-image, and the ability to shape reality. When silence occurs without internal detachment, it can still leave the narcissistic system intact. Silence creates a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. In narcissistic dynamics, that vacuum is often filled with reinterpretation, denial, or self-serving narratives. Without challenge, the story becomes whatever best protects the ego. Silence does not force accountability. It often removes the need for it. There is no requirement to confront behavior, repair damage, or acknowledge impact. From the outside, silence looks like strength, but internally, it can function as avoidance rather than disruption. Another reason silence is misunderstood is that it can still involve emotional engagement. A person may be silent while constantly thinking, replaying conversations, waiting for regret, or monitoring for reactions. From a psychological standpoint, this is not disengagement. It is continued investment. Narcissistic systems remain powerful as long as they occupy mental and emotional space. Silence without detachment does not remove that power. It simply shifts it inward. Silence can also be interpreted as ambiguity. Ambiguity allows hope, fantasy, and imagined control to persist. Narcissistic dynamics often rely on uncertainty to keep others psychologically tethered. When there is no clear boundary, no stated limit, and no behavioral change, silence becomes a pause rather than an ending. The system remains open, even if no words are exchanged. Most importantly, silence alone does not challenge entitlement. Narcissistic patterns are disrupted by clarity, not absence. Clear boundaries, emotional neutrality, and consistent non-engagement communicate something silence cannot. Access has changed. When silence is paired with healing, it becomes irrelevant rather than provocative. But when silence stands alone, it is often misread as power, while quietly preserving the dynamic it was meant to end. Narcissistic injury is often misunderstood as something caused by rejection, abandonment, or emotional pain. In reality, what creates the deepest disruption is not loss of connection, but loss of control. Narcissistic patterns are organized around maintaining dominance over perception, narrative, and emotional outcomes. As long as that dominance exists, absence alone is tolerable. What becomes intolerable is the realization that influence no longer works. Control in these dynamics is not always obvious. It can take the form of provoking reactions, eliciting explanations, creating confusion, or positioning oneself as central to another person's emotional world. Even conflict can serve this function. What matters is that responses are predictable and emotionally charged. When someone stops responding in expected ways, the system destabilizes. The injury occurs not because someone is gone, but because the familiar levers no longer function. Loss of control also threatens identity regulation. Narcissistic systems rely heavily on external feedback to stabilize self-image. When that feedback disappears or becomes neutral, the internal structure wobbles. Silence can still allow imagined influence, but emotional neutrality removes confirmation entirely. There is nothing to push against, no reaction to reinterpret, no emotional data to extract meaning from. This absence of feedback is far more unsettling than physical or communicative distance. Another critical aspect is narrative control. Narcissistic dynamics depend on shaping the story. Who is right? Who is at fault? Who is desirable? Who is wounded? When someone disengages emotionally and stops defending or explaining, that narrative loses traction. The inability to provoke self-doubt or emotional engagement creates a form of psychological invisibility. The system no longer knows how it is being perceived, and that uncertainty is deeply destabilizing. Loss of control also exposes limits. Narcissistic patterns assume access to attention, emotional energy, and reaction. When boundaries are enforced without emotion, that assumption collapses. The realization that access is no longer guaranteed creates discomfort that silence alone cannot produce. It confronts entitlement directly, without confrontation or argument. What remains is a stark awareness that influence has ended, and that awareness, more than absence, is what creates true narcissistic injury. Healing is disruptive because it removes the emotional mechanics that narcissistic dynamics depend on. These dynamics are sustained by reactivity, self-doubt, and a constant search for validation or repair. When someone begins to heal, they no longer participate in those processes in the same way. Healing does not announce itself loudly. It shows up as regulation, clarity, and emotional consistency. This quiet shift is profoundly destabilizing to systems that rely on chaos and imbalance. In narcissistic dynamics, power is maintained through emotional volatility. Confusion, guilt, hope, and fear keep a person psychologically engaged. Healing interrupts this cycle by restoring internal stability. As self-trust grows, the need to explain, justify, or defend diminishes. This is not withdrawal out of fear, but disengagement rooted in clarity. The system loses its primary source of energy because the emotional charge that once fueled it is no longer available. Healing also changes perception. Instead of viewing interactions through the lens of survival or approval, healed awareness recognizes patterns without personalization. Behavior is seen as information rather than a verdict on self-worth. This shift removes the capacity for manipulation to land. When words or actions no longer create emotional spikes, their impact dissolves. What once provoked anxiety or urgency becomes neutral data, and neutrality is incompatible with narcissistic control. Another disruptive element of healing is boundary consistency. Healing produces boundaries that are not reactive or punitive. They are calm, repetitive, and non-negotiable. There is no emotional performance attached to them. This consistency removes the illusion that persistence, pressure, or emotional intensity will eventually restore access. The absence of fluctuation communicates finality without confrontation, and that finality destabilizes expectations of control. Healing also eliminates the need for validation from the very system that caused harm. Approval, understanding, or acknowledgement are no longer required for internal equilibrium. This independence dismantles the relational imbalance. When someone no longer seeks recognition from an external source, that source loses its power. The dynamic collapses not because of conflict, but because participation has ended at the psychological level. Healing does not fight narcissistic dynamics. It makes them irrelevant, and irrelevance is the most profound disruption such systems can experience. Boundaries are often mistaken for silence, but they function very differently within narcissistic dynamics. Silence can be ambiguous and emotionally loaded, while boundaries are clear, structured, and behavioral. What makes boundaries more impactful is that they directly interfere with access. Narcissistic patterns rely on the assumption that access to attention, emotional energy, or reaction is negotiable. A boundary removes negotiation entirely. A boundary does not argue, explain, or seek agreement. It simply defines what will and will not be engaged with. This is deeply uncomfortable for narcissistic systems because it eliminates the opportunity to provoke, persuade, or destabilize. Silence can still invite pursuit or fantasy, but a boundary communicates finality through action. When behavior consistently meets the same response every time, the system loses its leverage. The most effective boundaries are unemotional. Emotional reactions, even negative ones, still provide information and engagement. Calm, neutral enforcement offers nothing to work with. There is no emotional spike to exploit and no inconsistency to test. Over time, this lack of variability becomes more disruptive than silence ever could. It communicates that the rules are not influenced by mood, pressure, or persistence. Boundaries also confront entitlement in a way silence cannot. Narcissistic dynamics often assume a right to explanation, access, or reaction. A boundary quietly rejects that assumption. It does not justify itself or ask permission. It simply exists. This challenges the belief that influence is automatic or deserved. The discomfort comes from realizing that control has limits and that those limits are being enforced without apology. Another reason boundaries are more impactful is that they shift focus inward. Silence can keep attention externally oriented, waiting for response or change. Boundaries redirect attention towards self-regulation and protection. The emphasis moves from what the other person is doing to what one will or will not tolerate. This internal shift removes dependency on external behavior for emotional stability. Over time, consistent boundaries erode the entire dynamic. They remove unpredictability, emotional intensity, and access all at once. The system cannot escalate, negotiate, or adapt because there is nothing to engage with. What remains is a clear, regulated stance that does not require absence to be felt. Boundaries do not disappear. They reshape the relationship at a structural level, and that structural change is far more destabilizing than silence alone. Narrative control is a central mechanism in narcissistic dynamics because it determines meaning, blame, and identity. Whoever controls the story controls how events are interpreted and how roles are assigned. Reactions, explanations, and defenses provide material that allows the narrative to be shaped and reshaped. When someone stops engaging in that process, the narrative begins to collapse, not through confrontation, but through absence of participation. Defending oneself often feels necessary, but it unintentionally keeps the story alive. Every explanation invites reinterpretation. Every attempt to clarify can be reframed as justification, guilt, or weakness. Narcissistic systems thrive on this ongoing exchange because it allows them to remain the author of meaning. When a person stops correcting the record, stops arguing facts, and stops proving their reality, the narrative loses momentum. there is no longer a dialogue to manipulate. The loss of narrative control creates psychological instability. Without feedback, there is no confirmation of how one is being seen. Silence paired with emotional detachment removes the mirror that narcissistic systems rely on. They cannot easily determine whether they are admired, resented, feared, or missed. This uncertainty is deeply unsettling because it disrupts identity regulation. The story that once provided coherence begins to fracture. Another destabilizing aspect is the inability to provoke self-doubt. Narcissistic narratives often depend on inducing confusion or guilt in others. When someone no longer reacts, explains, or defends, there is no evidence that the narrative is working. The lack of response signals that the story is no longer central or influential. What was once a tool for control becomes irrelevant noise. Stopping narrative engagement also restores internal authority. Instead of outsourcing meaning to external interpretation, a person becomes the sole interpreter of their experience. This shift removes the power of misrepresentation. The story no longer needs to be agreed upon or validated. It simply exists internally, grounded in self-trust rather than debate. Over time, the absence of narrative participation creates a vacuum that cannot be filled through manipulation. There is no audience, no rebuttal, and no emotional payoff. The system loses its stage. What remains is a one-sided performance with no impact, and that loss of influence is more destabilizing than conflict ever could be. Visibility without access is one of the most destabilizing shifts in narcissistic dynamics because it disrupts the expectation that presence automatically equals influence. In these patterns, being seen has traditionally meant being able to provoke, extract reactions, or shape emotional outcomes. When someone remains visible but emotionally and psychologically unavailable, that assumption collapses. The system cannot reconcile presence with the absence of control. Visibility alone is not threatening. What creates discomfort is the contrast between visibility and non-engagement. A person may be living fully, functioning well, and moving forward, yet offering no emotional openings. There are no signals to decode, no reactions to interpret, and no evidence that influence remains. This contradiction unsettles narcissistic expectations because it removes the link between observation and access. This dynamic also undermines fantasy. When someone disappears completely, imagination can fill the gap with narratives of longing, regret, or unresolved attachment. Visibility disrupts those narratives. It provides evidence of independence without providing a point of entry. The system is forced to confront a reality in which the other person exists outside its emotional orbit. That realization creates discomfort because it exposes the limits of control. Another destabilizing element is the loss of comparative power. Visibility without access communicates self-sufficiency. There is no performance of distress, no signaling of loss, and no invitation for repair. The absence of visible impact undermines the belief that one's presence is necessary or central. The system can observe movement forward, but cannot attach meaning to it in a way that restores dominance. This form of visibility also removes the reward of pursuit. Attempts to re-engage often rely on the assumption that availability can be negotiated through persistence or intensity. When visibility is paired with consistent non-responsiveness, those attempts yield no emotional return. The lack of payoff extinguishes the behavior over time, not through confrontation, but through futility. Most importantly, visibility without access reflects internal healing. It signals that identity, regulation, and self-worth are no longer contingent on external validation. This internal shift is perceived as loss of influence, not because of absence, but because presence no longer invites participation. The system is left observing a life it cannot enter, and that separation, clearly defined yet calmly maintained, is far more destabilizing than disappearance ever could be. Revenge keeps a person psychologically tethered to the very dynamic they are trying to escape. Even when it appears empowering, revenge maintains focus on the other person's reaction, pain, or recognition. That focus preserves emotional dependence. Narcissistic dynamics thrive on being central, whether the attention is positive or negative. When actions are motivated by revenge, the system remains intact because engagement has not truly ended. The shift from revenge to freedom is subtle but profound. Freedom does not require the other person to understand, regret, or change. It removes the need for acknowledgement entirely. This is deeply threatening to narcissistic patterns because it eliminates their role as the emotional reference point. When someone no longer needs an outcome from the other side, control dissolves without conflict. Peace is not passive, it is regulated. It comes from internal stability rather than external resolution. Narcissistic dynamics often condition people to believe that closure must come from confrontation or validation. Freedom dismantles that belief. Closure becomes an internal process grounded in self-trust and clarity. The system loses relevance because it is no longer required for emotional equilibrium. Another critical element of freedom is the restoration of agency. Revenge still orbits the past, reacting to harm that has already occurred. Freedom is oriented toward the present and future. It redirects energy toward personal values, safety, and growth. This redirection removes the emotional charge that once sustained the dynamic. Without emotional investment, there is no leverage left to exploit. Peace also changes perception. Instead of viewing interactions as battles to win or losses to avenge, they are seen as information that no longer requires response. This neutrality removes meaning from provocation. Narcissistic systems depend on emotional significance to maintain influence. When significance disappears, so does power. Choosing freedom over revenge also restores dignity. It affirms that one's life is not organized around another person's behavior. This quiet reclamation is destabilizing because it cannot be countered or manipulated. There is no argument to engage with and no reaction to provoke. What remains is an independent internal world that does not revolve around injury or retribution. That independence, sustained over time, is the clearest signal that the dynamic has truly ended.